Some people spend their entire lives building wealth and success for the next generation. But what happens when the person expected to inherit everything becomes the one accused of destroying his own family? For Nolan Buchanan, the 14th of September 2015 was supposed to mark the beginning of a bright future. At just 16 years old, he believed his life was finally falling into place. With a loving girlfriend by his side, a seemingly complete family, and a construction company that he believed would one day be his, Nolan thought the world was waiting for him. But just over 2 weeks later, the teenager was handcuffed in the middle of a classroom, leaving his classmates in shock. 3 years later, a jury would need less than 2 hours to deliver a verdict that stunned the nation. 150 years in prison, 3 lives lost, and a mystery so disturbing that even seasoned investigators would spend years piecing together what really happened. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you're fascinated by real-life cases, hidden mysteries, and stories that make us question human nature, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue bringing you more compelling stories in the future. The story truly began on the morning of the 13th of September 2015. At around 10 a.m., firefighters in Greenwood, El Dorado County, California, received reports of a wildfire spreading across a remote property. After bringing the flames under control, they discovered a small cabin that had been almost completely destroyed. At first, nothing seemed particularly unusual. Wildfires were not uncommon in California. But as firefighters moved deeper into the charred remains, they came across blackened bones mixed among the collapsed wooden debris. Initially, many assumed the remains belonged to animals. But then, a familiar smell stopped everyone in their tracks. A smell that forensic experts knew all too well. It wasn't an animal. It was human. And even more horrifying, the remains buried beneath the ashes did not belong to just one victim. No one knew exactly what had happened inside that cabin. No one knew who had been the last person alive. And no one could have imagined that the very first person to tell the story to investigators would later become the man prosecutors believed had caused it all. Before we continue, here's a question for you. In cases like this, what do you think is the most terrifying possibility? A. The killer is a complete stranger. B. The killer is someone no one ever suspected. Leave your answer, A or B, in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. To understand why the Greenwood case would leave investigators puzzled for years, they first had to turn back the clock and revisit the story of the Buchanan family before everything ended in tragedy. To those who knew him, Adam Buchanan appeared to be the picture of success. He owned Buchanan Construction, a company that had operated in California for many years. After the collapse of his first marriage, Adam raised his son, Nolan, largely on his own. Despite the demands of running a business, he always tried to provide his son with a stable life. Things seemed to take a positive turn when Adam met Molly McAfee. At first, Molly was simply an employee working for his company, but over time, their professional relationship grew into something deeper. Friends and family noticed that the two quickly formed a strong connection, and before long, they decided to build a new life together. When their son Gavin was born, the family of 4 appeared to have found happiness. Photos taken over the years showed what looked like an ordinary American family. Weekend getaways, birthday celebrations, and simple everyday moments painted a picture that gave no indication of the cracks slowly forming beneath the surface. For years, Adam's business had provided a comfortable lifestyle. The family owned several assets and eventually purchased a large property in Greenwood, where a small cabin stood isolated from the rest of the world. To Adam, it was a peaceful retreat, where the family could escape the noise and stress of city life. But as time passed, pressure began to build. Buchanan Construction started facing financial difficulties. Debts continued to grow, projects stalled, and the burden of keeping the company afloat weighed heavily on Adam's shoulders. People close to him later admitted that he became increasingly short-tempered and struggled to control his emotions. The atmosphere inside the home began to change as well. Arguments became more frequent. According to relatives, Adam and Molly disagreed on many issues. At one point, the couple had even begun sleeping in separate rooms and seemed to be holding the marriage together largely for the sake of the children. In a personal journal that would later be discovered, Molly documented the exhaustion and emotional strain she had been experiencing. Her mother even admitted that she had feared the ongoing tension between the couple could one day lead to something terrible. Whenever the arguments became too intense, Molly would often take Gavin to stay with her parents for a few days before eventually returning home. And then life would continue as though nothing had happened. That cycle repeated itself for years. Meanwhile, Nolan Buchanan was entering his teenage years, a stage in life when family turmoil can leave a deep and lasting impact on any child. From the outside, the Buchanans still looked like a normal family. But sometimes, the greatest tragedies do not begin with gunshots or bloodshed. They begin with small cracks that no one truly pays attention to. And in September of 2015, those cracks would ultimately lead to a tragedy that no one could have imagined. In the days following the fire in Greenwood, most people believed it had been nothing more than a tragic accident. Even the firefighters and some of the first investigators at the scene had no idea they were standing at the beginning of what would become one of the most shocking murder cases in El Dorado County. But sometimes, a single detail is enough to change the entire nature of a case. Once the scene was deemed safe for a thorough examination, forensic specialists began their painstaking work. Amid tons of ash, charred wood, and twisted pieces of metal warped by extreme heat, they carefully collected every fragment of bone that had survived. The process took hours. Then came an unexpected discovery: a fragment of a skull bearing a clear gunshot wound. In that moment, every assumption of an accidental fire collapsed. This was not an accident, and the people buried beneath the ashes had not died from the flames. They had died long before the fire ever started. The atmosphere within the investigative team changed immediately. What had begun as a fire investigation had now become a homicide case. New questions emerged almost instantly. Who pulled the trigger? What happened inside that cabin that night? And perhaps most importantly, was the killer still out there? DNA testing eventually confirmed the identities of the three victims: Adam Buchanan, Molly McAfee, and 8-year-old Gavin Buchanan. Autopsy results revealed that all three had been shot before the fire broke out. The blaze itself was not the cause of death, but rather an attempt to destroy the evidence. That discovery led investigators to a chilling conclusion. Someone had murdered all three victims, then calmly set the cabin on fire and walked away. Another detail quickly caught the attention of investigators. There was no murder weapon. In cases involving murder-suicide, the firearm is usually found near the bodies. But after days of searching, investigators found nothing. No gun. That fact pointed to only one possibility. There had been a fourth person inside the cabin, and that person had taken the weapon with them. The case had now entered an entirely different stage. With a crime scene that had been almost completely destroyed, investigators had to reconstruct the final hours of the victims' lives from scratch. They needed to know who had been the last person to see the Buchanan family alive, who knew they would be traveling to Greenwood, and who might have had a motive to harm them. As those questions remained unanswered, one person emerged as the most important witness. Nolan Buchanan, the 6-year-old, appeared to be a victim of the tragedy as well. Calm and cooperative, Nolan described the events of that fateful weekend to investigators. According to him, he had stayed behind in Bonita while his father, stepmother, and younger brother traveled to Greenwood. He also mentioned that his father had experienced conflicts with certain people in the area. At the time, no one questioned his account. To investigators, Nolan was simply a teenager who had just lost nearly his entire family. But what they didn't know was that in the weeks ahead, every detail of his story would be carefully scrutinized. And as the truth slowly began to emerge, the entire investigation would be turned upside down in ways no one could have imagined. Once the investigation officially shifted toward homicide, detectives realized they were dealing with a killer who was not only ruthless, but also calm and calculated enough to attempt to erase all traces of the crime with fire. What troubled them even more, however, was the fact that the scene had been almost completely destroyed. All that remained were blackened bones, a handful of scattered clues, and countless unanswered questions. Over the following days, every possibility was explored. Investigators revisited the troubled marriage between Adam Buchanan and Molly McAfee. Molly's journal, accounts from family members, and the couple's long history of arguments made the theory of a tragedy originating within the family seem plausible. Had an argument spiraled out of control? Had one of them snapped, committed the murders, and then taken their own life? At first, it seemed like a promising direction. But very quickly, forensic experts encountered one question they could not answer. Where was the weapon? If this had been a murder-suicide, the firearm should have been somewhere within the ruins. Yet after days of carefully sifting through layers of ash and debris, investigators found nothing. The missing weapon shattered that theory, and it meant something even more disturbing. Someone had left the scene after all three victims were already dead, which meant there had been a fourth person inside the cabin. At that point, investigators turned their attention to relationships outside the family. From early interviews, they learned that Adam had previously been involved in a dispute with a neighbor who lived near the Greenwood property. Tensions over land boundaries and alleged illegal activities in the area made detectives consider the possibility of revenge. Numerous interviews were conducted. Witnesses were questioned. People's movements were carefully verified. But in the end, everyone had solid alibis. Once again, the investigation had reached a dead end. When the Greenwood lead failed to produce results, detectives shifted their focus back to Bonita and began looking into Buchanan Construction. The company's financial struggles opened the door to another possibility. Could this have been an act of retaliation? During the investigation, several former employees came under suspicion. Some had been unhappy after being laid off. Others were believed to have had conflicts with Adam over business matters. But one by one, those names were eliminated. The deeper detectives dug, the more they felt as though they were chasing shadows. Every promising lead seemed to lead nowhere. The case appeared to be right back where it had started. Then, on the 19th of September 2015, an accidental discovery changed everything. A group of students participating in a cleanup project near the Buchanan construction office found a wallet hidden beneath some bushes. Inside were identification cards belonging to Adam Buchanan and Molly McAfee. Just a short distance away, police discovered a .22 caliber rifle. For investigators, it was like seeing the first ray of light after days spent in darkness. The firearm was immediately sent for forensic analysis. Meanwhile, detectives continued searching the area surrounding the company office, and it was there that something seemingly ordinary was about to transform the entire case. A security camera. No one realized that the footage stored inside would cause every previous theory to collapse. And for the first time since the investigation had begun, detectives started to understand that the truth they were searching for might be far more horrifying than anything they had ever imagined. After weeks of hitting one dead end after another, investigators finally obtained what they had been waiting for since the very beginning of the case. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a secret witness. It was something far less dramatic. Data. The .22 caliber rifle discovered near the Buchanan construction office was sent for forensic analysis. While waiting for the results, investigators began re-examining everything they had previously taken for granted. That was when the company's security camera system delivered an unexpected discovery. According to earlier accounts, Adam Buchanan had supposedly driven the company's Dodge truck to Greenwood to transport rocks for work on the property. But the surveillance footage told an entirely different story. The vehicle captured on camera wasn't the Dodge. It was Adam's white Ford F-150. At first glance, it seemed like a minor detail. But experienced investigators understood that in complicated cases, the truth is often built from the smallest pieces. If Adam had indeed driven the Ford to Greenwood, then why had the truck later reappeared in Bonita after all three victims were already dead? Who had driven it back? That question suddenly cast doubt on previous statements. From that point on, detectives decided to reconstruct the Buchanan family's entire journey using only objective evidence. Traffic cameras, receipts, bank records, credit card histories. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to come together. Then, a transaction at Taco Bell caught their attention. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary fast food receipt. But upon closer inspection, investigators noticed something unusual. 4 drinks had been ordered, not 3, which meant that besides Adam, Molly, and Gavin, there had been a 4th person in the vehicle that day. That discovery began to undermine everything investigators had previously been told. They continued tracing the family's movements through surveillance footage and financial records. Gradually, the bigger picture began to emerge. The Ford was seen traveling toward Greenwood. Hours later, it appeared again, heading back toward Bonita. But this time, there was only one person behind the wheel: Nolan Buchanan. Many investigators were stunned. The teenager they had viewed as a boy who had just lost his father, stepmother, and younger brother was now beginning to emerge at the center of the entire case. But they refused to jump to conclusions. Years of experience had taught them that suspicion is not evidence. They needed more. And soon, Adam Buchanan's credit card transactions provided even more disturbing answers. Long after forensic experts determined that the 3 victims had already died, Adam's card continued to be used at various locations: a coffee shop, a gas station, a fast food restaurant. There was only one possible explanation. The person using the card could not have been Adam. Someone had deliberately used it, perhaps to create the illusion that he was still alive. But what seemed like a carefully planned cover-up had unintentionally left behind a trail. The Ford F-150 was also subjected to a detailed examination. Forensic specialists discovered red soil clinging to the tires. The composition matched soil samples taken from the Greenwood area. It indicated that the truck had indeed returned to the scene. But the piece of evidence that changed the entire case came from the .22 caliber rifle. The forensic results finally arrived. Investigators discovered Nolan Buchanan's fingerprints on the weapon. For many people, that was the moment the case was essentially over. But for investigators, the feeling wasn't relief. It was disbelief. Because after weeks spent pursuing neighbors, former employees, and countless different theories, the truth had brought them right back to where they had started. The first person to appear as a witness, the person who had helped reconstruct the family's final days, the person everyone sympathized with, and the person almost no one had considered. On the 1st of October 2015, deputies from the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office entered Bonita High School. In the middle of class, before the stunned eyes of classmates and teachers, Nolan Buchanan was handcuffed and led away. But for prosecutors, the arrest was not the end, because the greatest battle was only just beginning. A battle that would continue for years inside the courtroom, and one in which Nolan Buchanan would offer an entirely different version of what had truly happened inside the Greenwood cabin on that fateful night. Nolan Buchanan's arrest did not mean the case had reached its conclusion. In fact, for both prosecutors and the victims' families, the most difficult battle was only just beginning. Despite facing 3 counts of first-degree murder, Nolan steadfastly maintained his innocence. According to the 6-year-old, what happened inside the cabin that night was very different from what investigators believed. Nolan claimed that he had merely been an unwilling witness to a horrifying tragedy. He told authorities that a violent argument had broken out between Adam Buchanan and Molly McAfee. According to his account, Adam lost control, shot both his wife and young son Gavin, and then turned the gun on himself. In a state of fear and panic, Nolan admitted that he had made mistakes afterward, but he insisted those actions were the result of shock and trauma, not because he was the killer. It was a story Nolan would continue to defend for years. His defense team also sought to portray Adam Buchanan as a man under immense pressure, struggling with financial problems, marital conflict, and an increasingly volatile temperament. Molly's journal, testimony from relatives, and the family's history of conflict were presented in court to support the theory of a murder-suicide. But prosecutors saw the case very differently. To them, this was not a case that could be decided by emotions or assumptions. It was a case built on evidence. Prosecutors argued that each piece of evidence, taken individually, might not have been overwhelming, but when placed together, they formed a complete picture. From surveillance footage, to credit card transactions, to traces left behind on the Ford F-150, and finally, to the fingerprints found on the .22 caliber rifle. Each piece of evidence was like a single thread, and when those threads were woven together, they all pointed to the same name, Nolan Buchanan. The trial lasted for weeks, with dozens of witnesses and forensic experts taking the stand before the jury. Both sides fought to convince the court that they held the truth, but in the end, the decision rested in the hands of 12 ordinary people. After hearing all the testimony and reviewing all of the evidence, the jury retired to deliberate. What surprised many people was how quickly they reached their decision. Less than 2 hours later, they returned with a verdict. On the 13th of June 2018, Nolan Buchanan was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 150 years in prison. For many, it was the moment justice had finally been served. Yet even after his conviction, Nolan never changed his position. To this day, he continues to insist that he is not a murderer. Perhaps that is one of the reasons why this case continues to be discussed years later. Not only because of the tragic fate of the 3 victims, not only because digital evidence played such a crucial role in solving the mystery, but because it raises a question that many people find deeply unsettling. How well do we really know the people closest to us? Because sometimes, the most terrifying part of a case is not the brutality of the crime itself. It's the possibility that the person responsible may have been standing in plain sight all along, appearing as a son, an ordinary student, a grieving victim, or simply someone nobody ever imagined was capable of something so horrific. And perhaps that contrast is what makes the Buchanan case such a chilling reminder that the most dangerous secrets are sometimes hidden inside families that appear perfectly ordinary. Before we end today's video, I'd like to leave you with a question. In cases like this, what do you think is more frightening? A. The brutality of the crime itself. B. The possibility that the killer could be someone no one ever suspected. Leave your answer, A or B, in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case.